Executive misalignment is one of the biggest causes of digital transformation failure, but what does it mean and how do we get alignment? I'm going to talk about that here in today's video. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting Group. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients through their digital transformation journeys. So when we look at why digital transformation and ERP projects fail, we can usually trace it back to one of two things. One is unrealistic expectations around what the project is going to take and require to be successful. And second is overall alignment as an organization. And those two things can be traced back to the executive team and the executive alignment. So what I want to talk about here today is how do we overcome this challenge of executive alignment on our digital transformation journeys. Now, I have two kids and I was married into the family and have two stepkids, so I kind of came in cold in terms of how to parent and how to raise kids. And one of the first things my wife and I did when we first got married was that we read Love and Logic, which is a book about parenting and how to teach kids how to make decisions and how to handle consequences and how to make decisions for themselves and how to take ownership of those decisions. And I hate to sound demeaning to executive teams, but a lot of times that's how executives need to be treated as well. We need to give them options. We need to provide a framework for executives to make decisions and understand what the trade-offs are as it relates to digital transformation. So there are several steps here that I want to talk through in terms of how do we get that level of alignment as an executive team, and how do we facilitate the decision-making and the ownership and the acceptance of the trade-offs and risks that come along with any decision in a digital transformation. So the first thing we need to do when driving executive alignment is to define what our corporate strategy is, and more importantly, translate that corporate strategy into a series of objectives and parameters for what this digital transformation means to the organization. So I want to visualize what I mean by that here. So let's just say you as an organization have a series of objectives. In this case, we'll just use 4 primary objectives. This is objective number 1. That might be to standardize and scale the company, or to act more like one company and act less decentralized and less fragmented and siloed than maybe we have in the past. That might be the first objective. And then we'll have a series of other objectives that we as an organization are trying to accomplish as part of our 3 to 5 to 10 year strategy and plan. Now, most organizations have a good handle on this layer right here. We find that most companies kind of know intuitively, or perhaps they've documented clearly what their vision, strategy, and objectives are as an organization. Where we run into trouble, though, is when we move down to a digital transformation. And we'll call this right here, this is the layer, we'll just call digital transformation, ERP, HCM, CRM, whatever you want to call it, or whatever your digital transformation entails. And oftentimes what happens is you see that this is clearly defined, we're chugging along in a clear direction here, but when we get to here, there's a misalignment here that's breaking that connection between the overall objectives and strategy of the organization and the strategy and objectives of the digital transformation. So what we need to do as a first step, and this is step number 1 in the whole process here, is to define how do we translate these objectives into digital transformation objectives. So in the case of this objective here for the organization that is trying to standardize operations, create a common operating model across a multinational organization, perhaps they're trying to act more like one company and act like one common face to their customer base globally, that's going to drive or translate to some parameters for your digital transformation. An example here to continue with that would be that's probably going to lead us more to finding a single ERP system that the entire globe uses. If our goal was to do the opposite and remain decentralized and act independently and act as disparate companies and in the name of flexibility, that might lead us to more of a best of breed model. So we're not getting quite into software selection yet. We're not evaluating systems. We're not identifying specific vendors yet, but we're defining what the parameters for this digital transformation should be. And that's an important part, is translating these objectives into specific objectives for the digital transformation. So once we've identified the objectives of the digital transformation, We have a clear vision of how we articulate our overall corporate objectives into digital transformation objectives and goals. Now it's time for us to identify alternatives. And this is where the love and logic concept comes into play, and I'll describe what I mean by that here in just a second. So we're identifying alternatives here. And I'm just going to give you a few examples of the types of alternatives we might describe. So I already described one of them, and think of these all as not an either-or decision, but more of a spectrum that needs to be defined. One decision would be centralized versus decentralized. So think of this as a spectrum here. This is not an either-or decision, but it's a spectrum that we're going to fall on. And what we need to figure out going forward is how centralized do we want to be, or how decentralized do we want to be as an organization. And again, hopefully we've started to articulate some of this up here in our strategic articulation. Another example would be big change versus incremental change. So we'll call it the degree of change spectrum here. So we'll say big changes. And it's not that they're small changes, I suppose, it's more that they're incremental changes. For some organizations, they really want to swing for the fences. They want to have a massive transformation, sometimes to be strategic and to get ahead of the competition, and other times it's because their industry is being disrupted. Retail is a great example. It's a common example of a company that they don't really have a choice, that it's not really an option for them to incrementally change. If they want to compete with Amazon and other e-commerce providers, they're going to have to go for big changes. Other companies will do so more strategically. So we want to figure out where on the spectrum do we fall, and a lot of this has to do with what our strategy is going to be, but also what our risk tolerance is. For a very conservative organization that historically doesn't like to take big risks, or maybe they've failed in the past in big transformation efforts, they may be more down on this side of the spectrum. Other organizations that have a higher risk tolerance, or they are more confident in their ability to manage those risks, they might be more on the left side of the spectrum here. And a third example of many, there's a whole plethora of things we usually help our clients define in terms of these alternatives, is going to be how much of this project do we insource versus outsource. And most companies are somewhere in the middle or some sort of hybrid, but there's different extremes here, of course, in terms of how organizations handle this. So some companies opt to outsource their entire transformation to a system integrator or consultants. Others decide to take it all in-house because they have the competency and the ability to handle it. Most organizations end up somewhere in the middle. But regardless, we want to see where on the spectrum we fall. So these are just three examples of many that we look at in terms of what are our alternatives. So now that we've defined what our alternatives are, and in our example here we have three basic examples, we need to drive a decision and look at where we stand as an organization or as a team. So one thing we do when we're facilitating this process with clients is we'll meet with executive teams and we'll define a color-coded approach to where they are today and where they're headed. So what we'll typically do is we'll use red to visualize where the different executives on the team fall on the spectrum. So if we're looking at our current state, it may be that these are individual perceptions of where we stand as an organization. Everything in red here, I'm just randomly doing this for illustrative purposes. You can see that most of them are kind of clustered over here toward decentralized. This is where we are today, not necessarily where we're going in the future, but where we are today. At the same time, or after we've identified where people's perceptions are of where we are today, we then shift gears to talk about where is it we want to go in the future. And as part of that conversation, we're also educating the executives of, we can move wherever we want on the spectrum, but we have to understand that there's trade-offs. There's no silver bullet, there's risks, there's going to be problems that come along with that, and we've got to be comfortable with that, and we need to know that we can handle those risks. So that's, again, where this whole love and logic concept comes in, that we don't want to give the executives an easy way out. We don't want to give them a silver bullet. We don't want to give them unrealistic expectations. We want to be brutally honest about what those trade-offs are. Once we've done that, then we come back to the team and say, based on what we know about those trade-offs, where do we think we want to head with this transformation in the future? And let's just say that as this example, using green as the color that we use to color code the future state, we find that most executives are kind of leaning this direction, but they're also a little bit scattered. There's no clear, easy, definitive answer. I know that's a little bit difficult to read with the bleeding of the colors here, but hopefully it makes sense that what we're seeing here are two things. One is that we see a clear shift from the red that we're leaning this way. Now we're shifting slightly this way to green. So that's telling us that we're dealing with an executive team that wants to move clearly to more of a centralized fashion. What we also see is that we're not aligned. So even though the average is kind of leaning this way on the future state, the average is leaning this way on the current state, and usually, by the way, we're usually more aligned on what the current state is because it's reality, it's what it is today, and it's less open to interpretation. And usually you see that there's less alignment in our definition of the future state. So in this example, where you see green that's kind of leaning this way, but you also see some people that are still over here in the decentralized model, we know that if we move forward with our team like this, where our executive team is misaligned, we're going to have misaligned decision making that's going to trickle down to our digital transformation. So in other words, if we're not aligned up here in terms of what we want the vision for the project to be and where the company is headed, we're going to have problems down here because we're not sure what the right answers are in day-to-day decision making as it relates to the project. So that tells us one thing is that we're not aligned, and secondly, it tells us that we are moving from one side of the spectrum to another, which means there's some change that comes along with that, which means that change management is going to be extremely important for this organization in this example. So we've gone through this exercise. We've defined alternatives. We've looked at where we think we stand in the current state and the future state. We've done this not just for the one example I gave here, but for dozens of different criteria that we look at in a transformation. What do we do now? Well, now we know the lay of the land. We know where the big gaps are. We know where the landmines are. We know where we're not aligned. And we know we've got more work to do to facilitate alignment here. And a lot of times it comes down to, like I said before, education and helping executives understand what the trade-offs are, and oftentimes painting a roadmap of different options. So we could go this route, and this is what it looks like. This is what the cost profile will look like. This is what the benefits would be. This is what the risks would be. Or we could go this way and stay closer to where we are today. This is what the cost benefit looks like, what the risk profile looks like. And again, we're putting the decision squarely on the executive team to make that decision, because we cannot have the project team at the digital transformation level making that decision when the executive team isn't even aligned on what they want the organization to be when they grow up. So we repeat this process as necessary through education, facilitation, until we get comfortable that we have a common vision for what this project is going to be. And then at that point, we can move forward with defining a transformation strategy and plan in more detail, a resourcing plan, budget, all that good stuff that supports the decisions we've made here. So one of the common questions we hear with clients is, this is great, we wish we would have done this from the start, and in a perfect world, you would do this before you start your digital transformation. But what if we've already headed down the path of starting the project, we've already gotten ourselves into trouble, we've already hit some speed bumps, whatever the case may be? That's okay. It's not ideal, but it's okay. We can still work around that. What we recommend in that case is, if possible, can we get alignment either in parallel with the project continuing, or do we have the luxury of time to be able to pause temporarily to get that alignment so that we can all make sure we're singing to the same choir book and we're all using the same playbook going forward? And oftentimes we find that by taking the time to pause, even though it sounds terrible, it sounds like we're slowing things down, your system integrator isn't going to like it, there's going to be a lot of people telling you not to do it, it'll actually speed things up later, because the better we can get aligned as a team before we get too far down the path, or if we already are too far down the path, if we pause to get that alignment, things are going to go much more smoothly and actually speed up later. So that's the trade-off we have to assess is it worth taking a time out to call an audible, to regroup, to revisit where we are as a team, as an organization, before we get too far further down that path. So if you are too far down that path, it's okay. There's ways around it, and I'd be happy to bounce around and brainstorm ideas. If you'd like to reach out to me, I've included my contact information below. So I hope this information helps. I've included some more information and documentation and downloads you can access in the links below. So I encourage you to check that out. If you're looking for more ideas on how to leverage best practices in your digital transformation, I encourage you to download those materials below. I also encourage you to please like and subscribe to this video. Hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks very much for your time.